The birth of the world and the first gods. At the dawn of time, when everything was a vast formless void, neither sun nor moon illuminated the abyss. There were only the depths of the sky and the infinite sea. Silence was absolute, like a heavy cloak that enveloped the entire universe, and darkness reigned, an endless void where nothing existed, neither earth, nor life, nor death. In that endless abyss, the heart of heaven, the sovereign of the heights, awoke from its deep sleep. He was an immense being, whose will was the engine of everything that existed or could exist. At their call, the first gods emerged, powerful and full of indescribable energy, ready to forge the creation of everything that would inhabit the world. Among them was Tepukan, the god of creation, whose mind was capable of shaping reality; Gukumats, the feathered serpent god, whose breath gave life; and Jackal, the spirit of war and the unbreakable strength that preserved order. Together, these gods formed a divine council, and the first task that awaited them was to shape the world, tearing it out of the void where all was chaos and desolation. Tepukan raised his hands into the darkness, and with a roar of titanic strength, his fingers tore through the silence. In that instant, a burst of infinite energy shook the confines of the abyss. From his hands began to rise mountains, which rose like giants of stone against nothingness, so large that their peaks touched the stars that did not yet exist. The heart of heaven took a deep breath and blew into the mountains, causing rivers of crystal-clear water to emerge from its bowels, traversing valleys that opened up like scars on the face of the nascent earth. The air began to fill with vibrant energy, as Gukumats spread his wings of golden feathers, invoking the winds that ran through the new forests that were born, giving life to the trees, whose roots pierced the newly formed earth, seeking the beating heart of the planet. Each breath of the gods transformed the primitive chaos into something tangible, something that began to reflect the balance of creation. In every spark of light, in every volcano that erupted and gave rise to new islands of fire, the gods felt the jolt of creation, a mixture of uncontainable power and the need to find harmony. The universe seemed to writhe under the weight of creation, and yet the earth continued to take shape, despite the roars of the gods and the fury emanating from them. The battle to shape the world was not easy. The heart of heaven, with his vision, saw how the seas crashed against the mountains, how the rivers overflowed, forming torrents of wild water that threatened to destroy the land that had not yet reached its final form. The waves swept away the work of the gods, and the fire of the volcanoes consumed everything it touched. Jackal, furious at the destruction, unleashed his power, summoning storms that shattered the earth into 1,000 pieces, seeking to restore the lost balance. The heavens darkened, the thunder rumbled like the roar of an unleashed beast, and the earth trembled beneath the feet of the gods. It was a spectacle of enormous strength, where the universe itself seemed to writhe under the tyranny of chaos. Despite the destructive forces that were unleashed, the vision of the gods remained steadfast. Tepukan, serene and full of wisdom, ordered the winds to bring calm. "We must shape the world, but with respect," he said in a deep voice, echoing in the void. "We cannot raise everything. We must be the balance." In that instant, the gods gathered their forces, and the heaven's heart, with a gentle but powerful breath, dispersed the dark clouds. The earth began to breathe, like a living thing. As rivers took their course, trees created shade, and mountains sat their weight in the heart of the planet. Finally, the land was ready. Creation, though not perfect, had managed to reach its primordial form. Mountains, valleys, forests, and rivers intertwined into an enigmatic, vibrant, and energetic landscape. But the gods knew that the hardest part of the task still remained. Now that the world was formed, it was necessary for more than just land and water to dwell in it. Creation needed life. "But who will inhabit this world?" asked Gukumats, his piercing gaze searching for an answer in the vast universe. "What being will be worthy to inhabit this sacred world?" Tepukan, with a sigh full of anticipation, replied, "Let's look for the perfect material then. Something that has life, that feels, that loves, and that respects the earth and the gods. Something that is worthy of this world that we have created." Thus, the divine council decided that the next creation would be something more than a mere form, a being that would carry within it the very essence of life. It was the time when the gods would set out to shape humanity, And although their creation would be more complex than any mountain or river, the gods knew that, without that divine spark, the world would be meaningless. The creation of man, a creation not only physical, but also spiritual, was about to begin. A new chapter would open in human history, one filled with challenges, sacrifices, and promises of power, but also chaos and struggle. The adrenaline of creation invaded the gods as, together, they traced in their minds the destiny of what was to come. Life would finally find its place in the heart of the earth, and the cycle of existence would begin to turn. But the gods knew that this process would not be easy. What was to be born would require not only power, but wisdom and balance. And in the creation of man, the greatest test for them was yet to come. The creation of the clay men, the newborn earth, still throbbing with the divine power that shaped it, began to beat in the hope of housing beings worthy of this newly formed world. The gods, although satisfied with their work, knew that something was missing. The world needed life, a life capable of understanding and feeling the pulse of the planet. And it was then, with the mind of the heart of heaven still burning, that the order was given. Let us mold the being who will inhabit this earth. Let's shape our children humans. With the fire of desire in their hearts, the gods began to gather mud, and damp earth, primordial components of creation. Gukyamats, with his gaze fixed, whispered the first words of creation, mixing with his hands the elements that would shape humanity. Let the clay be the flesh, and the earth the breath, he said, his voice echoing in the bowels of the earth itself. Tepukan, with the strength of a titan, modeled the first figures. The gods watched as the clay men began to take shape. Sturdy bodies, muscular legs and arms, faces that reflected a faint glimpse of what they might be. In the silence of the cosmos, creation seemed to be moving steadily, but the gods knew that something fundamental was still missing. These men could not move on their own, nor could they breathe with a will of their own. They had neither soul nor thought. On his body, the mud was still lifeless. With the same passion with which they had shaped the earth, the heart of heaven blew on the clay figures, attempting to infuse them with the divine spark of life. The wind whirled in, shaking the air, and enveloping the figures as if it were a sacred touch. But nothing happened. The clay men remained inert, mute, empty. They couldn't move, they couldn't feel or express what they were meant to be. Its shape was perfect, but its essence was a terrifying void. A palpable tension ran through the air. The gods looked at each other, surprised and frustrated. The attempt to create a humanity, which at first had seemed so promising, had failed. Tepukan frowned, feeling a growing frustration. "It can't be," he murmured, watching the clay figures stand firm but empty. Gukyamats brought his face close to one of the figures, touching the clay face with his fingers, and somehow, he felt that something vital was missing. The spark, the soul. "This way is not enough," he said, his voice filled with unfathomable sadness. It was then that the heart of heaven, with its gaze laden with knowledge, gave its judgment. "The clay form is weak. We need something that will resist more, something that not only has form, but also harbors the essence of the divine." And with these words, the wind of creation began to stir again, bringing with it the feeling of defeat, but also of hope. The gods would not surrender so easily. For a moment, everything seemed still. The first clay figures, unable to stand on their own, crumbled before the astonished gaze of the gods. The dust and pieces of mud melted into the air, as if they were nothing. The sun, just a faint glow on the horizon, seemed to mock them, reminding them that the time for perfection had not yet come. The heart of heaven looked toward the horizon, its mind searching for an answer in the stars. The clay men did not resist. As the first rains began to fall, the fragile consistency of the figures unraveled, and what had once been a solid, firm body was transformed into mud, disintegrating with the force of nature. The rains that fell on them, which had been part of the divine breath, now became their condemnation. The water, the same water that was supposed to give them life, destroyed them. The world did not accept their fragility, and with the passage of time, the forms that had been created with so much effort disappeared. Only the dissolved mud remained, a reminder of what could have been and wasn't. The gods, looking at the mess they had caused, were overcome by a mixture of anger and sadness. The heart of heaven roared in a shriek of frustration that echoed throughout creation, an explosion of energy that shook the heavens. The wind rose, the air throbbing with the fury of the gods in the face of defeat. But deep down, a spark of wisdom shone in Tepukon's eyes. "This failure is not the end," he said quietly, but with unwavering determination. "Form is not enough. We must find something else, something that is worthy of the world we have created, something that has a soul, life, the ability to feel." The moment of despair was short-lived, as the gods knew that creation was an endless cycle of trial and error. In their hearts burned the passion for a world that was meant to be perfect, and if the creation of the clay men had not been successful, it did not matter. The challenge continued. Gukyumats, with his wise gaze, began to walk towards the edges of the newly formed world, seeking the answer that the gods needed. "Let's look for other material," he said, full of conviction. "Something that gives life, that allows you to feel, that is worthy of this land." The gods gathered once again, knowing that the next step in the creation of mankind would be even more challenging. The failure of the clay men had shown them the most fundamental truth: the body without a soul could not exist. Humanity had to be something more than just form. It had to be something that connected with the divine, with the very essence of the universe. "The mud is just the skin," said the heart of heaven. "We must look for what is in the heart of the earth, what is capable of withstanding storms and growing with life." Thus, as the last drops of rain fell on the mud of the mudmen, the gods withdrew, but with renewed purpose. They knew that humanity could not be born of fragility. True creation was coming, and in their quest, the gods of earth, wind, and sky would soon find what they needed to create true humans, those who would carry with them the very essence of life. The failure of the clay men was only the prelude to a new and grandiose creation. The journey continued, and the creation of humans was far from over. The creation of the wooden men. Frustration after the failure of the clay men still burned in the hearts of the gods. But the heart of heaven, with its vast and wisdom-filled mind, knew that they could not give up. The creation of the human being had to continue, and the failure of the first attempt had shown what was not working. Perfect matter was yet to be found, and the gods were willing to try whatever was necessary. Thus, the mind of the gods came together, and a new idea emerged: wood. Wood was stronger than clay, able to stand firm against the forces of the world. However, the gods knew that wood was also devoid of life, of soul. It was just matter, as clay was, but perhaps it could be the key to a stronger, more lasting being. Tepukon, the great creator, was the first to give the order. "We will use the wood of the oldest trees, those that have withstood the strongest storms," he said in a voice that resonated with the authority of a king. Gukyumats, with his outstretched wings and ancestral wisdom, sought out the most imposing trees, those that rose to the sky, writhing toward the divine. The gods took the wood, carved it with divine precision, modeling human figures, tall and muscular, with strong and resistant bodies, capable of walking, running, and reproducing. These wooden men stood tall in the newly formed world, firm and austerely beautiful. When the gods breathed on them, hoping to breathe life into them, what happened was unexpected. The wooden men opened their eyes, but not in a conscious way. His gaze was empty, without depth, without understanding. They could move, they could walk and reproduce, but they didn't know why they did it. They felt no gratitude for the gods who had created them, nor did they show any emotion. The earth, the rain, and the wind, all that surrounded them, did not arouse in them the reverence or respect that the gods had expected. There was no soul in them. They were empty beings, who walked like automatons, with no other purpose than to exist without questioning. The heart of heaven watched with a mixture of amazement and bewilderment. "How is this possible?" he murmured. "We have shaped them, we have given them movement, but they are not aware of themselves. They cannot comprehend their own existence." Creation, though stronger and more resilient than that of the clay men, had failed in a different, much deeper way. The gods tried to dialogue with the wooden men, to talk to them about creation, about the heavens, about the earth, about their place in the world. But the wooden men only stared at them, blankly, as if the words of the gods were a distant, meaningless murmur. Gukyumats, the feathered serpent god, flew around them, attempting to breathe life and wisdom into them. But nothing happened. The wood of their bodies was strong, but empty. The divine spark that had ignited life in other creatures had not reached them. They had no soul. They had no understanding. Tepu Khan, sensing a growing despair, tried once again to blow on one of them, hoping that this time the gods might awaken the consciousness in the wooden men. But what came out of his lips was only a sigh that faded into thin air, quickly dissipating like dust. Over time, the gods began to realize the magnitude of their error. The creation of men of wood, though physically superior to that of clay, lacked the essence of life, the spiritual spark that made human beings worthy of creation. The wooden men had no gratitude. They did not worship the gods, and worst of all, they did not understand the sacred balance between nature and the divine. They were empty mechanical beings, who could not feel what the gods had put into their work. The heart of heaven, tired of the failed attempts, rose in all its fury, letting its energy radiate throughout creation. "These beings do not understand the greatness of what we have done," he said in a deep voice, resounding in every corner of the world. "Without gratitude, without understanding, they cannot be considered worthy of living. They must be transformed, because existence without consciousness is the true condemnation." The wrath of the gods erupted like thunder as Jackal, the warrior god, raised his spear and uttered a cry that ripped through the sky. A bolt of pure energy pierced through the air, striking the wooden men with such force that their bodies began to crumble, as if the very essence of life was fading away from them. The wooden men, being touched by the divine energy, began to transform into primitive creatures, animals without soul or consciousness, without the ability to think or reason. As the gods' lightning struck them, the wooden men lost their human form, their faces became disfigured, and their bodies became covered with fur. The gods watched in horror and sadness as these beings, once part of their divine creation, turned into monkeys, beings incapable of speaking, of understanding, of thinking. The creatures, once men of wood, were now fleeing, leaping from tree to tree, lost in the chaos of their transformation. They were the shadow of what they might have been, a warning about the importance of consciousness, of the life-giving essence of the flesh. And as the gods watched this process, they knew that the creation of the wooden men had not only been a failure in terms of form and strength, but also in the depths of being. The men of wood had not been able to connect with the divine, to understand the sacrifice and the greatness of creation. Gukyamats, the feathered serpent god, looked at the gods sadly. "The essence is more important than the form," he said. The wooden men were able to walk and reproduce, but they lacked what makes a truly human being, the soul. Only when the divine spark ignites the mind, the heart, the conscience, then can we call them our children. The heaven heart, with a piercing gaze, nodded. "This will be the last failure. Now we know what we need. True creation must go beyond form. It must be a combination of body, soul, and spirit." The gods, though struck by failure, knew they had to move on. The creation of the wooden men had been a valuable lesson, a lesson in the importance of the soul, of conscience and respect for the gods and life. They could not afford another failure. The creation of mankind was to continue, but this time, the gods knew that the answer lay somewhere deeper, more sacred, something that neither wood nor clay could contain. And in the silence that followed the destruction of the wooden men, creation continued, closer to its true purpose than ever. The destruction of the wood men, and the divine lesson. The creation of the wooden men had been a failure of cosmic proportions, and although their bodies were strong and their ability to reproduce perfect, their soul was a terrifying void. These beings, like shadows of what they might have been, roamed the earth, unable to comprehend the grandeur of the creation that had brought them to life. Their eyes reflected no gratitude, nor did their hearts feel the divine call. The gods, witnesses of his indifference, finally understood what was missing in his work. They had created powerful bodies, but at the same time empty, beings without souls, without consciousness, without respect for their creators, or for the world they inhabited. The heart of heaven, surrounded by the gods, rose above its throne of clouds, its grave face and its gaze fixed on the wooden men. The frustration and anger accumulated by centuries of failed attempts were transformed into a cosmic roar, the sound of divine fury condensed into a single word: ungrateful. The energy vibrated through the air, shaking the ground itself. The wooden men, unable to understand what was happening, only looked at the sky, oblivious to the storm that was looming over them. However, the heart of heaven would not stop. Creation is not just a gift, he said in a deep voice. It is an act of veneration for the divine. If you do not understand his purpose, if you do not feel the gratitude of being alive, then you must be blotted out of this world. The wind began to blow strongly, with the fury of a hurricane. The trees shook and the sky darkened, being covered with black clouds as a harbinger of punishment. Tepukan raised his hand, pointing to the wooden men who walked aimlessly, immersed in their emptiness. These beings do not know the balance of life, he said in a resounding voice. They have disconnected from the world around them, as if the soul does not belong to them. It's time for them to pay for their ingratitude. In the blink of an eye, the gods discharged their judgment. Jackal, the warrior god, raised his spear of pure energy and hurled it into the air with blinding speed. A bolt of fire and energy struck the ground, creating an earthquake that shook the earth. A shudder ran through the air, as if all of nature feared what was going to happen. The wooden men, being touched by the divine lightning, fell to their knees, their bodies beginning to crack. Their wooden legs splintered, and their skin fell apart, as if the very essence that had formed them was torn away by the cosmic forces of the gods. But the scariest thing was yet to come. Gukyamats, the god of feathered serpents, spread his wings and flew over them, his presence obscuring the sky. As he descended, a torrent of divine light overflowed from his chest, opening the earth like a crack of fire. The wooden men, trembling, began to hear a series of voices echoing in their minds, voices of ancient spirits and fallen gods, whispering to them the truth they had never understood. The soul is not created from wood, the voice resounded. You are not complete beings without understanding, without the divine flame. The wooden men shouted, but their voices were only echoing, fading into the void. The energy around them disintegrated them, as if all that they had been was absorbed by the darkness of their unconsciousness. But what happened next was even more disturbing. The roots of the trees began to twist and grow like snakes. The earth itself split under the feet of the wooden men, while the wind began to load the air with dust. The creatures writhed, their wooden flesh tearing and transforming. What had been human became something more primitive, something without soul or spirit. Their bodies were covered with fur. Their hands and feet became claws. Their eyes were stripped of reason and conscience, leaving them empty, like those who only knew how to survive. The wooden men, those who once walked like humans, became monkeys. Its descent to the bottom was brutal. The gods watched in silence, with the weight of their judgment in their hearts. The heart of heaven felt no compassion, only the certainty that the lesson must be learned. The sacrifice of these beings was necessary, not only for creation, but for the cosmic order. Mankind cannot be born without a soul, without respect for the divine, he said solemnly. Only those who understand the value of life and the connection to the sacred will be able to exist in this world. The monkeys, now part of the natural landscape, ran aimlessly, imitating the gestures of the wooden men they once were. Their existence was reduced to a distant echo of what they might have been, a palpable warning from the gods. In his eyes there was no longer consciousness, no memory of what they were. They were beasts, lost in the jungle, their souls faded, and their bond with the gods severed forever. And so, the lesson was taught to creation. Gratitude, respect, and conscience became fundamental principles of the divine order. The fall of the wooden men, their transformation into monkeys, represented the tragedy of humanity when it forgot its divine origin, the spiritual connection that linked it to the gods and nature. The silence that followed the destruction of the wooden men was profound, as if the entire universe was waiting for the next step. The gods knew that only by understanding the importance of the divine, of life itself, could humanity achieve the perfection they longed for. Not only was strength or the ability to reproduce enough, but true creation had to carry with it the soul, understanding, humility, and respect. Only then could men walk alongside the gods and be part of the eternal cycle that sustained the world. Gukyamats, observing the result of the failed creation, raised his gaze to the horizon. This is not the end, he said firmly. Humanity will be reborn, but it must be worthy of its life. The soul will be its guide, and the connection with the divine its strength. The gods knew that the next attempt would be the last, and this time, creation would be different. Humanity emerging from the next creation would have to understand the sacred relationship between man and the divine. For without soul, without respect, without gratitude, humanity would be nothing more than shadows in the darkness, lost in the vastness of creation. And the cycle of life would continue, seeking perfection in the fragility and wisdom of creation. The birth of true humans, the corn men. The wind, once stirred by divine fury, died down, and in the silence that followed the destruction of the wooden men, the gods gathered, contemplating what was left of their failed attempts. The heart of heaven, whose face had been marked by tension and anger, was now serene. It was clear that there was only one option left. A new attempt, but this time, with the purest divine power, with the very essence of life. Corn, Gukyumats whispered, his voice echoing through the air like the song of a coiled serpent. Corn is the beginning of everything. Corn is our essence. Only with him can we create true humans. The other gods nodded, acknowledging Gukyumats' wisdom. It was true, corn was much more than just food. It was the sacred symbol of life, the principle of creation, and the link between human beings and the divine world. In each grain of corn, the essence of the earth, the water and the sky resided. In each ear, the force of nature, the eternal cycle of life. And so, under the light of a sun that seemed to have been reborn after the storm, the gods gathered at the center of creation. Tepukhan stretched out his hands toward the earth, and the pure light of his being merged with the essence of corn, gathering the golden grains that fell like heavenly rain. With a fluid movement, he began to knead the earth and corn, mixing the essence of life with the primordial pulse of the universe. The corn dough shone with an ethereal glow, as if each grain contained the very soul of creation. Gukyumats, with his sharp, piercing gaze, watched the process, making sure that every move was filled with the wisdom and respect they had learned from previous failures. Jackal, with his formidable strength, took the mass and began to shape the first figures. The hands of the gods worked with dexterity, giving life to bodies, to faces, but not only with flesh and blood. Something else was beginning to emanate from these figures, the divine breath. And when the last figure was molded, Tepukhan breathed upon it, infusing it with the breath of life, the spark of consciousness. At that moment, the first cornmen opened their eyes. Their gazes, full of wonder and understanding, met those of the gods. They were not simply flesh figures. They were complete beings with soul, mind, and heart. And within him, gratitude blossomed, like a seed germinating in the fertile soil. The men of corn looked at the sky, at the sea, at the mountains, with a clarity that the creatures of clay, or wood, had never had before. They knew what they were, they knew what they represented. Not only were they formed by the earth, but they were also part of creation itself. They were the manifestation of the perfect balance between the physical and the spiritual. They were humans, the first true humans. The heart of heaven, its enveloping presence like air, smiled. They will understand what we wanted. In them resides gratitude, understanding, and the soul. They are our children, our equals. The cornmen rose, their bodies strong and firm, but with an inner flexibility that only sentient beings can have. They could think, they could feel, they could communicate with each other with a deep understanding. But most importantly, they could understand the gods. They could feel their presence in every tree, in every ray of sunshine, in every drop of rain. They had been created to respect and be grateful, to live in harmony with the earth and the universe. Gukyumats moved closer to them, his voice soft but charged with power. We have given you life, but it is through your hearts and souls that you will be true. Corn is what you are. Corn is what you will always be. Cherish him, venerate him, for from him comes the strength that sustains you. And at that moment the corn men understood. The connection that united them with the earth was more than physical. It was spiritual, it was eternal. The gods had given them the gift of life, but also the responsibility of maintaining balance with nature, of taking care of the earth and the skies, of always remembering the importance of corn in their existence. Tepukhan extended his hand toward the first maize men. leading them into a field where the maize grew tall and strong. "You see," he said, pointing to the golden ears of corn swaying in the breeze. "Corn is our offering, our connection to the cycle of life. Like corn, you will grow, flourish, and bear fruit. But you will always, always remember where you came from." And as the corn men began to walk the earth, seeing the world with new eyes, the earth itself seemed to beat with a new energy. The trees rustled in the wind, the rivers flowed more strongly, and the sky shone brighter. Everything had been created for a divine purpose, and the corn men were the culmination of that purpose. But it was not only the corn men who understood their role. The earth, the animals, the air, and the water, all the elements of the world, resonated with the new energy that the corn men brought with them. They were the guardians of creation, the custodians of life, and corn would be their eternal link to the divine. Over time, the maize men began to cultivate the land, sowing the sacred grains that fed them, and also reminded them of their origin. They knew that corn would not only give them physical sustenance, but also spiritual sustenance. Each harvest was a celebration of life, an opportunity to thank the gods for the divine gift of existence. Jackal, watching from above, understood that his mission had been accomplished. Humans, finally, had been born as they should be, not just flesh beings but conscious beings, beings who understood their place in the world and the importance of harmony with nature. The heart of heaven, whose gaze spanned the horizon, pronounced the last words of this chapter with solemnity. "This is just the beginning. The corn men are first, but others will come after them. May they always remember that corn is the source of all that they are, and that their existence will be an eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth." And as the sun set on the horizon, bathing the world in a golden light, the men of corn began their journey in the world, knowing that their destiny was intertwined with corn, with the earth, and with the gods. And so true humanity was born, like a seed that had germinated in the earth, ready to blossom in all its greatness. The teaching of the gods and first knowledge. The sun slowly rose above the horizon, illuminating the earth with a golden light that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the gods. The men of corn, now true beings of flesh, soul, and spirit, were gathered in a clearing, observing with amazement the world that their eyes had only recently learned to see. Before them, the gods rose, their forms shining like stars in a sky that seemed to expand before their eyes. They had been created, but there was still much to learn. They were not just flesh and blood beings. They were the guardians of life, the custodians of the balance of the world, and the gods knew that the real test for them began now. Tepukan, with his gaze fixed and his face serene, took the first step towards the men of corn. His voice, deep as the roar of thunder, filled the air. "You are not mere creatures of the earth. You are the chosen ones to maintain the balance between the heavens, the earth, and the sea. The world is alive, and with it you must live in harmony. Everything has a purpose, everything has a cycle. Now you will learn from us, from the gods, what is necessary for your existence to be full." The corn men bowed to the gods, their hearts pounding with the knowledge of their connection to them. They knew that their lives were not a coincidence. His existence had a divine purpose. But what did it mean to live in harmony? How should they walk through the world? Gukyamats, the feathered serpent god, raised his voice with the softness of the breeze, but with the same authority as the wind that guides storms. "The earth has given you corn, but corn is not only food. Corn is life itself. Learn to cultivate it, to respect it. The earth is your mother, and the mother is cared for, respected. If you sow with love, you will reap with gratitude. But if you sow in anger, in greed, or in disdain, the land will give you back what you have given." With these words, the gods began their teaching, not only about how to plant corn, but about how to read the winds, how to listen to the murmur of the rivers, how to interpret the signs of the sun and the moon. Every element of nature had a purpose, and the men of corn had to learn to listen to its voice. It was a profound knowledge, a wisdom that transcended words, that was found in every corner of the natural world. The gods guided the first humans through the fertile fields, teaching them how to sow corn seeds in the dark and rich soil. Each seed they planted was a symbol of life, of hope, and when the first corn plants began to grow, the roots were intertwined with the earth and with the hearts of men. The cycle of life and death began to take on meaning for them. the corn men learned that life was not a linear process, but an eternal circle. The corn that died was transformed into the food that gave them life, and when they themselves died, their bodies would become fertility for the earth. But the gods did not only teach on earth. Each of them imparted wisdom on the deepest aspects of human existence. Jackal, the god of death, with his grim face and piercing gaze, approached the men of corn and spoke to them of death, not as an end, but as one more step in the eternal cycle. Death is not feared in our kingdom. Death is the return to the heart of the universe, the return to the roots. When death comes, do not avoid it. Accept it because it is part of life. In the realm of the dead, you will find rest, but also knowledge. Death is another way of learning. These words filled the corn men with a mixture of reverence and awe, but they also understood that death was not something to be feared. It was instead a return to creation itself, a process necessary for the balance of the universe. While the gods were teaching humans about life, the world around them kept changing. The winds blew strongly, bringing with them the rustling of the trees and the singing of the birds. The rivers, once calm, were agitated, as if responding to the presence of the gods. It was a reminder that nature was alive, that it was not separate from humans, but deeply connected to them. But the men of corn had to learn more. The gods taught them about the cycles of day and night, of the sun and moon, of the passage of time. Each cycle represented an opportunity to grow, to learn, to renew oneself. Tepukan spoke to them of the sun and the moon, symbols of light and darkness, of the polarity that existed throughout the universe. The sun is your guide, but the moon teaches you the wisdom of the night, of the hidden. The two are the same, and both are necessary for life. You must learn to walk in light and darkness, without fear of what both bring. The men of corn, as they listened to these teachings, began to understand the profound meaning of the balance between the visible and invisible forces. Day and night, sun and moon, life and death, were not opposites, but complementary forces that formed a whole, that needed each other for the cycle of life to continue. Throughout this process, the gods also taught them the importance of gratitude. Every action, every thought had to be imbued with a deep respect for creation. The corn men learned that nothing in the world existed without a divine purpose, and that even the smallest things deserved to be cherished. Every ear of corn, every drop of water, every breeze of wind was a blessing. They learned to be grateful for life, for the earth, for the connection with the gods. In this moment of teaching, the corn men began to understand the power of words. Words, the gods said, have the power to create and destroy. It was words that shaped the universe, and therefore, they had to be used wisely. The gods taught the men of corn the first prayers, the first songs, the first prayers. Those words, charged with divine power, would be his link with the spiritual, his means of communicating with the gods. As time went on, the maize men began to live in harmony with the land, growing corn and other crops, respecting the cycles of nature, and honoring the gods. They knew that although their life was short compared to the universe, they were part of an eternal cycle that would never stop spinning. Thus, the men of corn began to understand the true meaning of their existence, to live in balance with nature, with the gods and with themselves. And as the teaching of the gods deepened in their hearts, they began to see the world not only with their eyes, but also with their souls. Divine wisdom was sown in them, and the earth itself seemed to whisper to them the secrets of the universe. Humanity had been born again, not only as creatures of flesh, but as beings aware of their place in the vast fabric of the cosmos. And with this knowledge, they began their journey to true existence. Corn as a symbol of life and sacredness. The earth, a generous mother, had given its first breath to corn. This small grain, golden like sunlight touching the skin of the gods, was not only the sustenance of life, but it was the very soul of the world. From the moment Tepukan, Gukumats, and the heart of heaven gave the corn men their final form, they knew that something sacred had been born. Corn not only represented the beginning of human existence, but it carried the divine power of the gods themselves. He was the seed of eternal life, and his existence was intertwined with the destiny of men, with the cycles of nature, with creation itself. The first corn harvest was a momentous event. It was not just an agricultural act, it was a sacred rite. Humans had learned to sow, to take care of them, to wait. The corn had been given to them by the gods, but it had also been entrusted to them as a promise of rebirth and continuity. In the heart of the cornfields, the cornmen felt that by touching the ground, by sowing the seeds, they were touching something greater than themselves, something divine that connected all the elements of the world. The earth, the sky, the sun, the moon, the gods. The days lengthened and the seasons passed. But there was always a time when humans looked to the horizon with hope and reverence. The harvest was not simply the end of a cycle, but the manifestation of divine favor. The fields, sown with dedication and love, rose in golden ears of corn that swayed in the wind, as if each of those grains of corn were a promise of life, the promise that death would never be the end, but only a transition to another cycle. The first ceremonies began on the eve of the harvest, when the air was charged with the fragrance of the damp earth, and the singing of birds, like an ancestral song, celebrated the rebirth of life. The priests, dressed in vibrantly colored ceremonial robes and adorned with sacred feathers, gathered around an altar made of stone, in the center of which rested a sacred corn. The crowd, who had gathered to witness this ritual of thanksgiving, prostrated themselves before the mighty grain, their eyes fixed on the stars, waiting for the gods, who watched from their heavenly abode, to accept their offering of gratitude. Sacred corn was the center of everything, the nourishment of body and soul. Each of its grains represented the ability of the corn men to sustain themselves, to survive, to grow. But, beyond its function as a physical source of life, corn represented the deepest and most sacred relationship with the gods and the earth. During the ceremonies, the seeds were blessed, and the first grain of each harvest was offered to the gods. It was burned in a sacred fire, and its fragrance, its essence, was released, which ascended to the heights where the gods waited, in an act of purification and divine connection. Ritual dance was the next step, and it took place around the large bonfires that lit up the night. The men and women, wrapped in the ardor of the celebration, moved like shadows dancing with the light of the fire. The sounds of the drums resounded like the beating of the earth itself, and the wind seemed to whisper to each participant, as if nature itself were absorbing every word, every movement. In those moments, when the corn was at its peak, time seemed to stand still. Humans were not only mortal, but beings with a deep and indestructible connection to the divine world. The first grain of corn was not just a seed, it was a symbol of creation. In its fibrous entrails lay the origin of the cycle of life, the principle of fertility, of regeneration. Each grain of corn planted represented the continuity of life, the return of the sun after each night, the rebirth after each storm. Thus, the planting of corn was much more than an agricultural necessity. It was an act of creation, a rite of faith, a reminder that the world was a living, cyclical, eternal organism. The priests, those in charge of maintaining contact with the gods, were not only the guardians of the ceremonies, but the transmitters of a secret knowledge that had been granted to them by the gods themselves. They were taught that corn was not just food, it was the spiritual link between humans and gods, an ancestral memory that was renewed with each harvest. During the darkest nights, when the corn was about to be born again, the priests taught the younger ones the sacred songs, those that spoke of the relationship between man and nature. It was a moment of transmission of knowledge. The secrets of corn, the stories of the sun and the moon, the lessons of sacrifice and gratitude, were woven into the hearts of the new guardians. As the years passed, the presence of corn in religious ceremonies became more intense. Every offering, every dance, every prayer revolved around this sacred symbol. The cornfields, with their golden ears, represented more than just a harvest. They were the living manifestation of divinity. And every time the men and women fed on this grain, they felt part of something much bigger than themselves. The earth had given them the corn, and in every bite, they renewed their commitment to the eternal cycle of life and death, the cycle that united men, the earth, and the gods. When the first rains of the season began to fall on the cornfields, the Mayan people knew that it was not just water, but the blood of the gods, which watered the land. It was an act of resurrection. The divine connection that corn represented was never just a symbol of food. It was the very essence of the human being, of the Mayan people. Corn was the blood of their ancestors, the life force that was passed down from generation to generation. Corn was ultimately the path to immortality. It not only fed the body, but it fed the soul, connecting the corn men to eternal divinity, to the cycle that never ends, to the eternal return of life. And so corn remained the central pillar of Maya life. A food, an offering, a sacred symbol, a constant reminder that life is not something taken for granted, but is a divine gift, a cycle that begins and ends with the sacred food that grows from the earth, corn. The evolution of humanity, and the promise of a spiritual future. Humanity had been created in the image of the gods, but it was not perfect. Not only had he received the sacred food of corn, but also the ability to grow, learn, and evolve. Over time, the men of corn had been developing their bodies, their spirit, their connection with the world and with the gods. However, this growth wasn't something that happened just by itself. It was an arduous path full of challenges, but also of great spiritual rewards. The first men, formed of corn, began to inhabit the earth. They were instructed by the gods in the arts of cultivation, dance, music, and above all, spiritual wisdom. It was the time when men learned to live in balance with nature, to respect the cycle of life and death, and to honor the sacrifice that the earth offered them. But the gods knew that this learning did not come easily, and each human being had to work to reach the understanding that had been granted to them. The path of man was difficult. In ancient times, the struggle for survival was fierce. The jungle was relentless. Swollen rivers washed away everything in their path, and the seasons were not always generous. But in every storm, the gods taught men that adversity was not their enemy, but their teacher. It was through suffering and loss that humans came to understand the true value of life. It was the eternal battle between light and darkness, between the life that springs from the earth and the death that claims it. But it was never a solitary struggle. The gods were always present, guiding, inspiring, and bestowing forces for humans to keep going. Over time, human beings began to build villages, to organize themselves into communities. Corn was no longer just a physical food, but a profound symbol of life and spiritual connection. Each seed sown was a reminder that man was to feed his soul as well as his body. However, not all humans followed the same path. Some got sidetracked, forgot the sacred teachings of the gods, and began to build a world without harmony. They became corrupt. They turned away from respect for the land, from gratitude to the gods. The world then began to become more violent, more selfish, because humans forgot the essential, the balance between the divine and the earthly. But despite everything, hope never died. The gods knew that humanity would always have the ability to return to the right path. In their moments of darkness, humans could still feel the divine presence, the whisper of the gods in the wind. Because the light of spirituality did not go out, it was only hidden behind the shadows. The gods continued to send signs, whisper advice, teach through dreams and visions. There was hope. There was always hope, because humanity carried within itself the divine seed of rebirth. As generations passed, humanity grew and evolved. Some peoples reached a deeper understanding of universal laws and began to expand their minds and hearts. They learned to build great cities, to dominate the heavens and the earth, to communicate with each other, to join forces. But at the same time, they also had to learn not to be swept away by power and greed. The gods knew that wisdom would only flourish in those who were humble and respectful of the world. Therefore, the gods brought new, more complex challenges for those who had reached a higher level of understanding. Humanity began to perceive that their life not only had a physical purpose, but that their spiritual existence was linked to the stars, to the moon, to the sun, to the earth itself. Everything in the universe was connected. The gods had given man the gift of consciousness, a divine gift that distinguished them from other creatures. Men and women began to see beyond the physical. They realized that, just as corn was reborn each season, life itself was an eternal cycle of death and rebirth. This cycle, this transcendence, was the true promise of the gods. No matter how many failures they faced, no matter how many times the world seemed to fall apart around them, the spiritual evolution of mankind would never stop advancing. The gods would never abandon their creatures, for the path to spiritual enlightenment was the very reason for human existence. Mankind was to learn to live in harmony with the universe, to transcend its mortal nature, and unite with the divine cosmos. Over time, humanity discovered the inner strength that resides in every human being. Each individual realized that they had the power to choose their destiny, to follow the teachings of the gods, or to drift into darkness. True strength did not come from war or external struggle, but from internal harmony, from the ability to seek balance in his life. The gods taught humans that inner peace was the path to transcendence. The Mayan peoples, as guardians of this knowledge, understood that the end of the cycle was not a definitive destruction, but a renewal. Death, disappearance, darkness, it was all part of the same cycle that gave way to a new life. Humans, then, began to understand that their existence was not limited by their time on Earth. True life was eternal life, that which returned to the gods, that which united itself to the cosmos, to the primordial force that had created them. In the end, the gods knew that humanity's journey towards spiritual evolution would never end. It would be an endless path, an eternal cycle of growth and learning, but always full of hope, always full of divine light. The promise of a spiritual future was that humanity, despite its failures, would always find its way back. And when that day came, when humanity finally attained spiritual fulfillment, the gods would welcome them with open arms, and together they would walk towards the eternal horizon, towards the great cosmic mystery, towards unity with the universe and with divinity. And so humanity, the creation of the gods, would become an eternal light, a flame that never goes out, a reflection of divinity itself. The story of the Popol Vuh, the sacred story of the Maya, invites us to a deep reflection on human nature, the path to wisdom, and the intrinsic relationship between the divine and the earthly. Through men's successive creations of clay, wood, and finally corn, the gods not only forged bodies, but planted an eternal lesson in the heart of humanity: the need for balance, respect, and gratitude to nature. The first attempt of the gods, the creation of the clay men, reminds us that, although the external form of a being may seem adequate, it is the internal essence that gives true meaning to life. The clay men could not stand, speak, or comprehend the world, reflecting that soulless physical creation is an inert void, unable to fully interact with life itself. This initial failure is a powerful metaphor for human superficiality, and what happens when we forget the need to go deeper into the inner self. When the gods try to create the wooden men, the story takes a more critical turn. These beings are physically stronger, but they lack soul, understanding, and gratitude. This is the great human error. Brute force with no spiritual connection, no awareness of what has been received from the gods, and no deep understanding of the divine purpose. The creation of the wooden men is a warning that life, even if built on a foundation of resistance and reproduction, will lose its meaning if there is not a deep connection with the divine and an inner humility to understand the purpose behind our existence. The punishment of wooden men, transforming them into monkeys, is a forceful symbol of what happens when human beings lose their capacity for appreciation and disconnect from the divine world. At this point in history, we are presented with one of the most painful but essential lessons. Spiritual disconnection has irreversible consequences, not only in the relationship between humans and gods, but also in the relationship between humans and the natural world. The monkeys, as descendants of these ingratitude beings, represent to us the deviation from what we could be when we depart from our divine nature and surrender ourselves to ignorance. Finally, when the gods create real human beings with corn, the story reaches its peak of wisdom. An essential and sacred food, corn not only represents physical nourishment, but is also a symbol of the continuity of life and the cycle of existence. Corn is the beginning of life itself, because it not only nourishes the body, but connects human beings with their spiritual essence, with the earth and with the gods. The creation of the corn men reminds us that the physical body and the soul are not separate entities, but are intertwined, and that one cannot fully exist without the other. The teaching of the gods about growing corn in harmony with nature is a lesson that resonates strongly even today. In our age, where materialism and disconnection from nature are increasingly evident, The Popol Vuh urges us to remember that we are an integral part of the earth, and that our physical and spiritual health is deeply linked to the harvest and the ancestral wisdom of living in balance with the natural world. Corn as a symbol also invites us to reflect on the eternal cycle of life and death. Just as corn is reborn each season, we as humans are also in a continuous cycle of transformation. Death is not the end, but one more part of the great circle of existence. Spiritual transcendence is in rebirth, in the constant evolution of our consciousness, in the ability to learn from our actions, to correct our mistakes, and to ascend to a higher level of understanding. The Popol Vuh presents us with a crucial teaching about the power of conscience and human responsibility in the creation and preservation of universal balance. Through the creation accounts, it is revealed to us that our existence is not determined by physical or material circumstances alone, but by a deep spiritual connection to cosmic forces. As human beings, we are the guardians of that balance, and our mission is to live in harmony with the laws of the universe, the laws of love, respect, gratitude, and understanding. The story also warns us about the lack of humility and the forgetfulness of the divine way. Humans, when they stray from respect for the gods and the natural world, fall into arrogance, selfishness, and spiritual disconnection. The Popol Vuh reminds us that we must always be aware of our roots, of our true nature, and never lose sight of the fact that we are created beings, humble and dependent on higher forces. Through its stories, the Popol Vuh not only tells us the story of the origins, but also invites us to reflect on our present and future. It challenges us to think about how our actions, our decisions, and our attitude toward life can bring or destroy harmony in our world. In the end, the wisdom that these stories transmit to us is not only in the knowledge, but in the practical application of that knowledge in our daily lives. Living in harmony with nature, respecting the gods, and cultivating our spirituality is the true path to evolution and transcendence. The Popol Vuh is not only a story of the past, but an urgent call to the present, a warning and a hope for future generations. Hello everyone. If you liked this story, leave me a comment and tell me what part caught you the most, or what emotions it aroused in you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and like it. Your support helps us continue to create exciting and emotional content. What other story themes would you like to see on the channel? Your ideas could inspire our next plot with unexpected twists. Thanks for joining us. See you in the next video.